Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Thursday, August 28th, 2025. We're going to be looking at the Republican best case scenario for the Senate going into 2026. We did the Democratic best case scenario just 2 days ago in the most recent video. So, what we're going to be doing today is going to be the converse of what we did, the inverse, essentially. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X, as well as stay up to date on election news in all three countries. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, to get into things, what we have first off is that we're looking at a potential very interesting season here going into 2026. Things could go relatively well for the Republicans, especially compared to 2018. We saw in 2018 this was the first cycle after Donald Trump took office, and things didn't go very well. There were quite a few scenarios that there were very large victories for Democrats across the board. They won in a lot of states that actually did end up losing re-election the following cycle. And so it was quite a bit of a bluer cycle, obviously, than it was in 2024. There were three states that the Democrats performed better than in 2018, but all the others were much redder at this point in time than they were in 2018. So this is going to be basically the baseline. But why might things not be better than 2018? Well, first off, we have here is that Donald Trump's approval rating is basically the exact same spot. So we're already starting with a general baseline that he's not doing worse than he did in 2018. So you'd expect a 2018-esque scenario at worst. And then you're going to go back and compare what the generic congressional vote looks like. We're looking at right now is Democrats plus 3.6. Now, that is great and all, right? A 3.6 scenario would generally be for the House. What we're looking at for the House in 2018, we had a D plus 8.5 scenario. And so even just plus D.3 for looking at the R plus 2.8 scenario of 2024, if you just shift that to the D plus 3.6 scenario, which would be by the popular vote margin, and then to 3.6, you end up with a somewhat large House majority for the Democrats, a 19-seat majority. And so that would actually be a flip there. That would be flips all over here. That would be a flip back. These would be holds at this point because they were already won the previous cycle. There would be two flips here. So you can see there would be, in fact, quite a few flips across the entire country. You can see some slightly closer races in some other areas. Things are going to be weird in Texas, though, because of uh, the new efforts there and such for redrawing the maps that did officially go through. But essentially, we would end up with a very interesting scenario here. You end up with quite a few flips, and there wouldn't be any Republican flips across the entire country. I'm pretty sure once we get rid of that one in North Carolina, yeah, there's none. Um, there wouldn't be many Democratic flips either. There would be a lot of holds, though. Across the country, there would be a few flips that came from 2024. That wouldn't be a flip either, so there would be no movement in the state of California. So basically, now what we end up with would be a 19 seats being flipped, and that would be 232 to 203. And this is the current now. This is based off the current polls based on the 2024 races, which obviously there's a lot of things that change, but this isn't necessarily a bad scenario. But the problem is that for the Senate, if we're basing it off of 2018, where they already lost a few seats because it was just a bad map, then right around now, even in 2018, we were averaging about D plus 9 or so in the general polls, and we're only at 3.5. So obviously, this could end up shaping up to be a worse scenario. If you end up shifting it, this was 8, this was about 9, and now we're at 3.5. That's a difference of 5.5. If you shift it 5.5 points to the right, then you end up with some very concerning numbers for the Democrats. And so that's going to end up being a very concerning thing for the Democrats. Tester would have lost. Um, Brown would have barely held on. Manchin would have lost. So this would have been a lot worse of a cycle for the Democrats they not uh, had they not won by as much as they did. So that would have actually been 6 flips for the Republicans, and they would have had 57 seats in the Senate, which would basically been insurmountable in future cycles. So now, when we're looking at the map in 2026, it's not quite as bad as things could have been here. The 2024 map obviously didn't go very well, but you do have Nevada and Arizona did stay blue, so that definitely helped, but that was the trade-off of Ohio and Pennsylvania. So that really hurts things for the Democrats going into this as well, but they did flip both seats in Georgia in the 2020 cycle. They flipped to there. They flipped Colorado, the other Arizona seat. And then on top of that, they flipped Pennsylvania. So they were able to gain. That's where they got those 4 seats from: one, two, three, and then four, which is now how they have 47 instead of about 41. So looking at here now is going to be the expected environment would probably be a bit worse than that. So potentially how things are going to go would be about an even national environment to potentially R plus one, which would be detrimental to the Republicans. But even just an R plus zero national environment would be enough to definitely screw things over for the Democrats. And so now we're already looking at some concerning numbers across the board in some states. And if we talk about potentially even an R plus one environment, now we're going to be looking at some even worse numbers. We're going to be going through state by state and looking at each individual race and seeing how things may go on election night. So now what we're going to be looking at is individually state by state. We're going to start off it in the with the safe states. There's not really much to say here, but we're gonna go in alphabetical order just because that's exactly how things are. Alabama, and actually no, we're gonna go in not necessarily in safe order though, because they're not necessarily from there. We're gonna go reddest to bluest, just because that is exactly how this ends up getting sorted out. So first off, in Wyoming, we have 44.2% for that's going to be for Lummis. He won by 45 points in 2020. Cynthia Lummis has confirmed she will run for re-election. So that is the reddest state in the entire country. So that is going to essentially be a very safe state. Next is West Virginia, 43.2%, essentially the exact same thing. Capito flipped the seat in 2014 after it was actually held by Nelson Rockefeller for decades after West Virginia stopped being a blue state. And that was also the case for Manchin when he won that seat in a special election after Byrd passed away in 2010, and he managed to win that by 10.1% after he was governor for a while. So then he was able to hold on to it for another cycle and a half. He was reelected in 2018 and then retired. So but now we are at the point where it's very, very, very red state, entirely Republican delegation, and in its entirety, red governorship, all both red districts, and both two senators are Republican, and always votes Republican for president. So it's a very, very Republican state. That's also going to go there as well. As you go to Idaho and South Dakota, these are relatively similar northern plains states. Up here, very Republican. We do have Richmond Rounds. Now, both of them are essentially expected to Oh, okay. Look at Okay, so that's starting from the bottom and then going up. So we're looking at here is in Idaho. He is in fact running, and then we also go to South Dakota's undeclared. Rounds is not announced whether or not they're going to run, but we're going to have to watch that for a bit. Oklahoma, 31.3, one of the reddest states in the entire country. Inhofe is currently undeclared, but as of right now, it appears it's going to be a very, very Republican state either way. Kentucky's actually going to explode in margin. McConnell only won by 19 and a half, which is very, very low by Kentucky standards. If you look in 2020, Donald Trump won on the same ballot by 26, so that's a 5 point overperformance from the incumbent senator. So obviously a very poor candidate. Definitely underperformed. You can see here the war ratings minus 9.6, which means that a generic Republican versus a generic Democrat, McConnell underperformed by 9.5 points. So what we have here now is obviously Kentucky at 19.9, so that's going 29.9. Louisiana is going to be 29.3. They have gotten rid of the jungle primary, but Cassidy is likely to still win re-election. We'll have to see how the primary goes, though. Arkansas, 28.9 points, another not very competitive race. Tennessee and Alabama are also above 20. These are above in the Appalachian Republican strongholds. Montana at 16.3%. This was actually under 12 in 2020. That was only because relatively popular ex-governor Steve Bullock was running. He won re-election as recently as 2016 by 4 points against current governor Greg Gianforte, who ran for his first term in 2020 and just got re-elected by 20 points in 2024. But other than that, it wasn't actually a very strong race. The reason that it was, in fact, relatively this close was just because it was the strength of the Democrat, not a weakness of the Republican necessarily. So probably going to be a much closer race, closer to that 19-point margin that should be expected or so. South Carolina 15.3. We do have that's going to be an increased margin. Graham ran against the best um, the highest. This was the largest amount raised for a Senate candidate in history, if I'm correct, for him. So he was able to pump out a lot of advertisements and such. So that definitely helped a lot against him there. So that was a large portion of why the race got so close. I don't see anything about that though, but I did hear that. I'm pretty sure that's correct. So with that, that is going to be why it was so close there, but with not as strong of a candidate, most likely this time around, it's not going to end up being that close. Kansas 11.4. This is only going to be likely. This is essentially the exact same margin as last time. Marshall is a relatively weak candidate at this point, but he only won by 11.4 on the same ballot that Donald Trump beat Joe Biden in the state by 14.6, another underperformer in the Senate. As of right now, he's undeclared whether or not he's going to run for re-election, but he's a relatively weak candidate in the main scheme of things. But he should still do relatively well at this point in time. Potentially, in a good night, he would end up being closer to 14, 15 points. But it would definitely be above 12. Mississippi, same thing there for Hyde Smith, would be over 12 points. She's a relatively weak performer. She only won by 9.98% in 2020, hence why it says 10 points. Rounded up. Not again, underperformer there for the most part. Alaska would probably be under 10. Completely depends on whether or not Mary Peltola ends up running here or not. And so that's really going to be where this race comes together, is going to be whether or not she ends up running for Senate or governor because of that undecisiveness. Kind of half of the benefit there is given to the Democrats, but on a good year, definitely she wouldn't run, and Sullivan would be able to basically make up a lot of ground there. Florida, 7.3 points would actually be over 12. Ashley Moody is a relatively strong performer there. It's a special election to take the remainder of the seat of Marco Rubio. I know she's a strong overperformer. She ran alongside Ron DeSantis in his landslide victory in 2022 by 19 and a half points. And so she actually, I believe, outperformed him on that same ballot. So she's a very strong candidate. And so with that, she is likely to end up winning that race, could end up winning by up to 12 points. One that I don't see going by 12 points is Ernst in Iowa, even though she hasn't announced whether or not she's running. Even in a strong scenario, I think she wouldn't be getting to 12 points. Even here, it's 5.5. So that would probably be closer to about 9 points, 10 on a really good night for the Republicans here, 9 to 10 points. Relatively strong candidates are running in the field in Iowa, especially with mostly due to the unpopularity of Ernst. And so JD Scholten withdrew. You have Josh Turek, who is a Iowa House of Representatives member. We have um, we also have primary challenges to her, so things could get relatively interesting. This is going to be an interesting race to watch as things continue on. Nebraska in a strong year, actually, it would actually, interestingly enough, it would be above 12. This one's going to be a bit of an outlier. Things could go very, very well or very, very poorly, depending on how things go. Sassy had retired at one point, so Ricketts actually, that's where he came from. But Dan Osborne's running against him, and in a really poor year, Dan Osborne would basically get no support from Democrats, that they wouldn't endorse him, and then he would perform relatively poorly amongst independents, and he would basically end up getting steamrolled by Ricketts by over 12 points. It is Nebraska, so that's the worst case scenario there. Texas would probably be right under 12 points, might be close to about 10 or so, and that would probably be with John Cornyn end up winning because he's a bit less controversial of a candidate and he is the incumbent. So with that, it would most likely be the best case scenario there, but that would still be the largest margin for a Senate race in Texas if it was just over 10 points since 2014 when Cornyn won by 27. So that would be a large improvement for the state as a whole there. Ohio 3.3, that would probably be around 6 points in total, which means that Republicans will absolutely hold on to their Senate majority and they're going to keep going. That would be close to about 7 points. Now that we are confirmed that Sherrod Brown is running, this is basically going to be a bit closer of a race. He overperformed, especially compared to how Kamala Harris did in the state by quite a lot. And so he's a strong candidate. He's able to do relatively well in any bluer environment. He could absolutely win this race. But if we're looking at an R+1 environment, especially, or even worse than that, he would absolutely lose this Senate race. Maine, 1.5 would actually probably be closer to about 4 points. It's going to be lean because it's under 6. And so with that, then we have another competitive race that would go red on the Senate level. This would be obviously relatively poor news for the Democrats at this point. Susan Collins won by 8.5 in 2020 on the same ballot that Joe Biden won the state by 9. So that's a 17-point split ticket voting. That's a relatively strong sign for her to be able to carry in. There's a relatively strong candidate and a relatively populist candidate running there, but that would end up being a strong situation for the Republicans. North Carolina would be next. Michael Whatley is taking over for Tom Tillis because he retired, and that would probably be a very strong result against the strong candidate that is Roy Cooper. But in a strong situation, you could end up having a potential situation where Whatley ends up beating Cooper by around 5 points on a really, really good night for the Republicans. The last time that Democrats held a seat in North Carolina in the Senate was actually this same seat, Kay Hagan, after beating Elizabeth Dole, Bob Dole's wife, in 2008. Then she went on to lose re-election to Tom Tillis in 2014. So it'll be interesting to see this seat go back after 2 cycles. But as of right now, it could end up being a very Republican seat, which means that they would not lose any seats, but they're just going to keep going. In Michigan, this would be a flip for the Republicans, probably by about 2.5 points or so on a really good night, just based on the strength potentially of Mike Rogers, who did a very strong job in 2024, only lost to Alyssa Slotkin by 19,000 votes, a third of a percentage point in the entire state. This was the second closest by margin in the entire country, only behind Pennsylvania, and was the closest by vote count. Barely second closest by vote count. Pennsylvania was a little bit closer. That margin's just barely lower enough that even though it's a much higher population, it's still less votes. So, and actually Nevada's more. So okay. So yeah, it was the second lowest in both margin and raw vote count in the entire country in 2024. And Alyssa Slotkin just narrowly pulled out ahead, but this could be a narrow flip for the Republicans on a ridiculously good night in a strong scenario. Then would be Georgia. This one is going to be relatively interesting. Jon Ossoff is a very strong candidate. As you can see, it was expected that he would lose by quite a bit. He outperformed by 3.7, and the WAR ratings minus 6.1. So obviously it's said that he's a very strong candidate, but he could lose on a really strong night for the Republicans by just about under 2 points. Brian Kemp said he's not going to run, but Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is also now running for governor. So the main question here is who's really going to end up being the candidate here. We have Mike Collins versus Buddy Carter. And then you also have Derek Dooley, but most likely the best situation here would be Buddy Carter, as he seems to be a bit more electable of a candidate than Mike Collins, and so the best case would be Mike Collins to drop out of the primary and allow Buddy Carter to then go straight to the general, so then he could potentially get more on messaging and such. New Hampshire's 3.3. This one, honestly, is very, very unlikely for Scott Brown to win, just because of the fact that even though Jeanne Shaheen is a very, very strong candidate, she won by 15.5 in 2020. That is an absurd overperformance. In 2020, Joe Biden only won the state by 7.5. But the fact of the matter is still that even in 2014 on the same ticket that Colorado voted for Republican by 2 points. Alaska flipped by 2 against Bigot, who is now running for governor. Daines flipped the seat by 17.5. Ernst flipped her seat. Cassidy beat Landrieu, who then actually went on to beat governor. Tom Tillis flipped it against Kay Hagan. Brown lost in New Hampshire by 3.2, even though it's a relatively strong, relatively red state, even though he actually had also managed to win in Massachusetts in 2010. He won that special election by 4.8% in Massachusetts. So he was able to win even in very, very strong red election years, but he wasn't able to pull off the victory in 2014. Yes, it was again it was against Jeanne Shaheen, who is a very strong overperformer, but I don't think that he's actually able to pull off wins in those very blue states. I think that even almost best case scenario, you will end up with Chris Papas winning the election, but not even by 3.3, but closer to about 2%, less than 2% or so. However, in New Mexico, I think again this is basically the exact same thing or so. It's just too blue of a state. Lujan isn't a very strong performer, actually, the exact opposite. The WAR rating is just barely 2.7, so that's gonna be a bit of a concern there for the Democrats. Not a very strong candidate, but essentially that's just that. relatively weak candidate, and it's going to potentially be relatively close. Colorado is going to be 11.3. This would be definitely closer to around 7 points on a really bad night. Hickenlooper would likely win, um, is likely going to win closer to about 10.5 points. But on a really poor night, you can end up with a very strong candidate in Colorado. And then you end up with Hickenlooper winning by a bit less than that. Illinois would definitely be hovering right around 9 to 10 points. It's also an open seat, so that is another thing, potential of concern there. It's also shifting hard to the right. Virginia would be interesting. This would be a very, very, very close race with a lot of spending if current Governor Glenn Youngkin entered the race. However, it's just too blue of a state, not to mention that Mark Warner is a very strong candidate. He won by 12.1 on the same ballot that Joe Biden got his very impressive 10.1 point margin in Virginia, the highest margin for a Democrat in Virginia since FDR in 1940 and 1936. So that is huge. He overperformed by 2%. So he's a very strong candidate. So even if Glenn Youngkin enters the race, I don't think that he would win, which is why he's probably not going to enter. So, but that in general is going to be a much closer race than the Democrats would have liked, and they would have had to spend money there as well. New Jersey, this would be just under 12 points on a really bad night. Cory Booker is a bit of an overperformer. He won by 16 on the same ballot that Joe Biden won by 16 on the nose, so he only overperformed by 4/10 of a point. But he is still relatively well liked, and he's unlikely to lose. So, but we're really going to have to watch the governorship in New Jersey, see how that state might continue trending. Oregon would be definitely above 12. There's not much to say there. Delaware, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are all very blue states with relatively strong candidates there as well. So there's not much to say in that respect. And somehow I missed Minnesota. Tina Smith's retiring. This would be definitely a low lean margin, close to about 3 points on a really bad night for the Republicans. I don't see them winning, especially with them rerunning Royce White. He's not necessarily a very strong candidate by any means, but he did give Amy Klobuchar her lowest margin of victory since she first flipped the seat back in since she first took the seat in 2006. Actually lower than that in 20 what was it 20 in one of her races, she definitely did a bit lower than that. I think it might have been a 2012, she won by 35. In 2006, she won by 20, and in this cycle, she only won by 15. So relatively low, but that would likely be a somewhat close margin. So this would be a very tough map for Democrats to overcome, especially considering what the 2028 map looks like. Would there be 5 flips in the Senate for the Democrats? They have Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. They have North Carolina. And then they would literally have the two incumbents. They would have John Husted, and they would have Ashley Moody in Florida. So they would basically only have 2 flip opportunities, which means they would only end up getting back to 53-47. So if this happened, that would basically seal the fate of the Democrats for the next while in the Senate. So that is all for today's video. Make sure to subscribe below if you are not already, and follow on all the platforms. Thank you all so much for watching, and let me know of any thoughts, opinions, comments, etc. Down below, and have a fantastic rest of your day.